Thank you so much for being here. I am always happy to be the last one of any type of series and get things done. I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you. Part of what we're talking about is how I suggest we move forward with this idea of using cultural competence to help create workplaces that are anti-racist, anti-biased. So as we go through this process, I'm going to be giving you a lot of information, a lot of suggestions. As Devin said, though, this is being recorded. So please feel free to kind of sit back, listen in. If you do have questions, though, pop those right into the chat. I'll kind of keep an eye on that, and hopefully Devin will help me keep an eye on that as well. And if it's something that needs to be answered right now, we can answer it now, but there should be time at the end as well to make sure we have time for questions and answer as well. So moving forward. All right, so the objectives of our session today, make sure we understand the concept of cultural competence and how it does apply to libraries, recognize behaviors that align with different levels of cultural competence, and then also identify culturally competent actions and behaviors to combat racism and bias. So when we talk about cultural competence, we start by, of course, trying to offer a definition, and definitions abound, and some of them exist within library science, but this concept of cultural competence did not begin in LIS, right? It's not something we created as librarians. It usually comes from either those in health sciences or the health field, or also from the business fields where you typically will see it, but also from sociology and from psychology. I like to pull a variety of definitions because it's a very interesting idea of how we apply this to different areas, right? So we move it from, libraries to hospitals to schools, and it's really important that we take a look at probably maybe 4 or 5 different ways that people have tried to define this concept, and we can usually see how this does easily translate over to libraries. And so I usually pull the Hansen et al. Definition first because it starts talking about this idea of awareness and understanding of how the different aspects of our human identities impact our understanding of human behavior and our ability to ethically and successfully work with culturally diverse communities. And for me, the important part of this definition is looking at the concept of human identity and how that does impact our behavior because we respond differently to people based on identities, but also the importance of working ethically. And that you have to be able to work ethically to do this work. And a reminder that maybe we weren't always working ethically when we're working with people from different backgrounds and different cultures. Now, Chow et al. Talked to us about having this ability to not only function in our own culture, but also to successfully interact with those from cultures outside of our own and cultures that are very different from our own. And I really like this definition because it's a reminder that even in our own cultures, we may not necessarily be able to function very well. I always talk about the fact that America itself has a culture, but even within America, it can be difficult to interact and to work well in that culture. So if you can work well in your own culture, you then have to think about how do I successfully interact and work well with those outside of that culture as well. Now, Wilson et al. Talked about the acquisition and the maintenance of cultural specific skills, and those skills are required to actually function effectively within a new cultural context. So if you go somewhere else, your ability to function within that cultural context, but also to interact effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds, no matter where you may interact with those people. And then Williams et al., they talk about the ability of individuals and systems to work or respond effectively across cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects the culture of the person or the organization being served. And I like to end with the Williams definition, mostly because of the fact that it brings in the idea that organizations themselves can be culturally competent or culturally incompetent, just as individuals working in those organizations can be culturally competent or culturally incompetent. And it's a nice reminder that a lot of what we talk about is about respect. It's about acknowledging and respecting others. And part of that process, of course, is helping us to become culturally competent so that we do acknowledge and respect others from different backgrounds and different cultures. Now, a lot of people don't realize that in 2012, so we're 10 years ago now, the Association of College and Research Libraries actually put forth some diversity standards that they expected academic librarians to follow. And I think we could argue that all librarians can look at doing this organizationally, even though, of course, what they put forth was for academic libraries, those working in higher education academia. But they were really trying to say that this is what cultural competence would look like for academic libraries in a way that hopefully people would apply. And I would argue that not everyone has actually seen these and that it's not necessarily taught. But it's something that we can at least look at as a first step, just trying to understand what cultural competence might look like in libraries. And I pull this as an example because I'm going to move forward and talk about the cultural competence continuum and applying things a little bit more broadly. But I thought it was interesting what they put forth and how this does align with the concept of cultural competence. And so they give you these 11 diversity standards, and they start out by talking about the importance of being culturally aware of yourself, so the self-reflection aspects, but also of others, which is one of the basic tenets of cultural competence. Also, this need to develop cross-cultural knowledge and skills, also looking at developing this within the organizational and professional values that we hold. So building cultural competence into our organizations through our values and through our structures. Also using this to develop collections and programs and services that are culturally competent, and how we also deliver our services. But they also offer a reminder about how cultural competence impacts things like language diversity and being aware of language diversity and respectful of that, but then developing a diverse workforce and having workforce diversity in our locations. And then the organizational, excuse me, dynamics that we actually have and that we develop. So if you worked in any type of library, you know there's usually hierarchies that exist in our libraries, and those dynamics that exist within those hierarchies may not necessarily be good or positive. And so they talk about the importance of noticing those dynamics and building culturally competent organizational dynamics. The importance of cross-cultural leadership, not only for those in leadership positions, but for those to help others to improve the way they work as well. So being a strong leader, being a positive leader. Using professional education and continuous learning to continue to grow within this process. And one thing you'll hear me repeat a lot when you talk about cultural competency is that it is an ongoing process, an ongoing learning process. You cannot attend one session with Dr. Bright or someone else and all of a sudden say, I am culturally competent, I'm going to go forth and be culturally competent. It's something that you have to always work at, and something that's always going to involve you learning and being very self-reflective. And then also the importance that we think about, and this is why this is so much academic libraries, but I know that public librarians and school librarians also do research and hopefully are doing research, but reminding ourselves that our research should also be culturally competent, that we are being inclusive of all voices in our fields and also those that we serve and support. And that's a really important reminder when we get to that final end of cultural competency in terms of giving back. Part of that process is adding on to the knowledge about cultural competency, and we do that usually through research. But when I think about this, I actually like to think about this on the cultural competence continuum. And a lot of authors have put forth variations of this continuum. I use the one put forth by Good because I like the way that it also includes organizations in the process, because sometimes we talk about libraries as organizations, and yes, we are the people who work in them and we help the organization move, but we also know that these organizations exist and have a history that often influences and impacts how we work with others. And so if you're looking at the cultural competence continuum, it tends to move from left to right, from cultural destructiveness all the way to cultural proficiency. And of course, people are usually surprised that cultural competence itself is listed as the fifth item instead of the last one, but there is a level above being just culturally competent that you hope to get to, and that's cultural proficiency. In general, when we talk about cultural destructiveness, we're talking about attitudes and policies, things that are in place, practices that are in place that are actually destructive to a cultural group. And so if your organization is working in a culturally destructive way, you're actually dismantling some of the beliefs or understanding or some of the tenets of a different culture. Now, more broadly, people ask, what does this look like? Well, if you think back historically to things like the Jim Crow laws, that would be an example of the United States functioning as in a culturally destructive way. We think about the Native American children being taken to the schools, and in many cases never making it out of those situations. Those are things that are culturally destructive. When you talk about cultural incapacity, this just means you don't have the capacity to actually respond when you know there are needs or interests for your group, your organization, your community, and usually based on cultural preferences or linguistic preferences, and you're not able to support those things. So you don't have the capacity to support those needs. As you move forward, though, maybe you're moving towards something with what they call cultural blindness. And what they really are talking about here is it's very similar to what we often see people refer to as color blindness, but this idea that we're going to view everyone and see everyone the same and treat them all the same because we're not different. And what that does, of course, is devalue or dismiss the culture and the history of people and how that influences their lives as well. As you move forward, more positive, of course, as you're going towards the right, you get to the cultural sensitivity, cultural pre-competence phase. And this is where you have awareness of the strengths and the areas where you might need to grow. And you're able to start responding effectively to culturally and linguistically diverse populations that you serve. Also, your colleagues, those that you work with. When you get to the cultural competence stage of the continuum, you actually exemplify cultural competence, but you do this through your actions. You do this through how you function, how you personally function as an individual, but also how your organization functions. And you show that acceptance and that level of respect of cultural differences. Now, cultural proficiency, if you reach that, is where you hold culture in the highest esteem, and it's seen as the guiding foundation of your work. So everything you do as an individual is based in cultural competence. Everything your organization does is based in cultural competence. I would say it's also often very difficult for people to get to the cultural proficiency stage. And one thing we do know about the cultural competence continuum is that people tend to backslide. So you make gains, and oftentimes you make gains very quickly. You go to workshops, you start doing some reading, but if you have a setback where you try to apply some of the things you've learned and they don't go as well, it's very easy for you to slide back and say, well, that was useless. It didn't make any sense for me to waste my time. It's not having any impact. And you sort of dismiss the gains you've made. This is where that self-reflection piece comes in, where it's very important that you remind yourself of how much you've learned and how much you've grown, and to continue trying. So even if you try something, I'm going to offer a lot of suggestions today for different ways to move out of these lower levels of the cultural competence continuum. And if it doesn't work, don't get discouraged, because it does take time, and sometimes you have to keep trying. You have to see why it didn't work the first time and figure out maybe next steps or a different way to approach what you're trying to do. All right, so what we're going to do now is actually take a look at some of the latter parts of the continuum. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't usually start with the cultural destructiveness phase, only because of the fact that if your organization is there, or if you're there, it's not impossible to get you out of, but it's actually very easy to get you out of that just by making a few small changes. And there's really nothing concrete you need to do other than starting to think about yourself and other cultures, and start thinking about other people and how you're different and why you're different, and why we need to acknowledge and respect that. But we do start with the cultural incapacity stage, which is because we have this understanding already. And we know we need to try to do something, but we feel like we don't have the ability to do that. And if you're in an organization, or if you are personally dealing with a situation where there's cultural incapacity going on, what you see a lot of are institutional bias. You see a lot of discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. You see a disproportionate allocation of resources, and that can be funding. It could also be personal resources, people time resources. You see devaluing of some cultural groups, and you also see reduced expectations for some cultural groups, whether they're working in the organization or using the services of the organization. Now, one thing you're going to notice as I go through these different phases of the continuum and start offering information is that there's a lot more information the lower you are on the continuum, right? The further left, because there's more things that you're trying to fix. As you get higher on the continuum, there's fewer recommendations because you're acting in a very culturally competent way. So just keep that in mind as you notice I'm going to be giving a lot of information here. Now, I'd like to share this slide because Dr. Monica Cox actually posted this on Twitter last year, and it just resonated with me because I was already thinking about what this looks like, what cultural competence looks like in an organization, and especially what institutional bias may look like, because not everyone's aware of what may run into institutional bias. And so what Dr. Cox says here is that you know who is being valued in your organization by answering some of these questions. And this is a nice reflective piece you can do. But think about situations where, there's been two different stories being told about a situation that happened in an organization, whose stories are actually being believed, whose complaints are being responded to, who's paid the highest salaries, who's given multiple chances. And what we often mean here is multiple chances to keep doing the wrong thing, right? Versus those who are maybe given only one chance to make a mistake. Whose bad behaviors are not being addressed, which means who's not being held accountable for their behaviors, and then who benefits from those organizational policies. And if you can make a list to answer those questions, and you can usually identify specific people or specific situations, you probably have some issues with institutional bias happening in your organization. And it's something you want to be aware of and start trying to make changes about. Now, the things we can typically address pretty easily, or try to address pretty easily, are things related to our hiring practices. And this, of course, is an area we still struggle with in libraries of all types. And a lot of it does start with our recruitment and our applicant review. you can't hire those from diverse, underrepresented backgrounds if they're not in the pool to be hired in the first place. So you always want to start out by making sure you're diversifying that pool for your positions. People tend to ask how you do this. A lot of it is word of mouth. A lot of it is actually reaching out and encouraging people that you think might be qualified or might know those who are qualified, who happen to be from a variety of diverse backgrounds, to actually apply for the position. Simply posting the job in certain places usually isn't enough to get people to apply, because it's not as personal as reaching out and encouraging and asking those questions. But you also want to look at diversifying your search committee. And I don't necessarily mean asking the few employees you may have who are from diverse backgrounds to always be on the search committee, because then you have this situation of them always being asked to do the work. I'm also talking about things like having someone there to serve as what we call an EDI reviewer. And the suggestion here is someone who's always on the committee, paying attention to the search, listening out for potential bias, making sure that the committee is focused on the job and on the people who are applying, and not focused on things that are not relevant to the position. And this person, of course, is on the committee and has a say, but their job is to make sure that you have a very clean and unbiased process going on. But also encouraging all committee members to complete intentional bias training. And this happens a lot more in academic situations now, because typically across the campuses, you have to do this. Other institutions, public libraries, school libraries, may not be doing this as a requirement, or may not even be worried about it at this time. But everyone needs to do it, because we all need to be aware that we have biases. We all have them. How they impact our decisions and how they influence our decisions is where we're worried about our search process. Now, you also want to think about looking at the evaluation process, especially when you're looking at applications, and try to identify some of those bias trouble spots. And we know there are usually 2 or 3 trouble spots that exist in the application review process. One of them is not relying on a rubric to help you to see if someone qualifies for a position. So you create what we call an objective rubric. That rubric is based solely on the job description that was created and the responsibilities of the job. As a matter of fact, that rubric should probably be created as soon as that job description is written. And then any interview questions should also be based off of that job description and the rubric. And all 3 of those things need to be connected, because that keeps you from having bias introduced into the process. But you also want to eliminate the use of the term fit, right? So this idea of whether someone fits in the job. Fit itself is valid, right? Whether or not someone's skills and background fit the position is valid. Unfortunately, the way we use the term fit is often referring to whether or not they personally fit in our organization. That could be their style of dress, the way they speak, their background, what school they went to. Does that really fit in our organization? So trying to eliminate that from consideration when you're looking at the suitability of someone for a position can go a long way towards removing potential bias. Also, as a reminder to evaluate what they say and not how they say it. And this includes the written word. So I talk about this with interviews as well, but not everyone writes perfectly. Not everyone's going to have grammatically correct letters that are sent in. And you really want to make sure that you are paying attention to what is actually being said, and not focus a little bit less on the grammar piece of things and focus a little bit less on maybe potential misspellings that may happen. Now, of course, if they get really out of hand, that is going to be a concern, but not small things that people tend to use an example of why someone is not qualified for a position. The final thing is this idea of appointing an external reviewer, if you can, for the overall pool and for the final candidates for the pool. This person is not on the committee. This person is someone, though, who does pay attention to what's going on. And if they're looking at your pool and they're thinking you didn't do a good enough job of trying to recruit for diverse hire, then they need to come back and say, well, where did you post? And did you send out calls? And did you ask people for recommendations? And if you've done all that and you still don't have a very diverse pool, then you're able to move forward at that point, knowing that you did your due diligence, right, to try to encourage people to apply. But they're also going to look at your final candidates, and they're going to ask you questions about how were they evaluated? Why did you rate certain people above other people? Because they're just trying to make sure that the process was actually fair. Listen, we have a question from Hannah here. How would we find an EDI reviewer for a search committee advice? Typically, what happens in most situations is it's someone who wants to volunteer to do it, has a strong either understanding of EDI practices. Like me, I do a lot of that work in my organization. So of course, if I'm on a committee, I'm kind of the EDI reviewer. I'm paying attention and listening for that. If you don't have someone who's already designated for that in their organization, there is this idea of helping someone train to do that. And so that person does go off and get intentional bias training. And they attend additional trainings just to better understand things like identity and privilege and power. And their sole purpose is just to help listen out and just make sure everyone is thinking and being fair in that process. Asking the right questions is typically what that person does. Is like if someone says, well, I just don't think this person is a good fit, your EDI reviewer is like, could you tell me more about that? Why is this person not a good fit? And it's encouraging people just to be able to describe what they truly mean, to make sure that what they mean is they don't have the skills and background for this job based on their CV or their resume or their letter, and not, I just don't think they'd be comfortable in our organization. And so typically you don't necessarily have someone in most organizations designated this way. But if you have someone who has interest in this and wants to be trained in it or wants to learn more about it or do this work, you can develop that someone into that position, into being that person. Now, depending on how many searches you do, you may want more than one person. This person, maybe not, that's not going to be their only job, right? They have other things to do, but it is a potential. We mentioned this as a possibility. Not a lot of places have this, I'm going to be honest with you. It's still not something that's catching on very well, but I think it's something that could be very beneficial. And as I mentioned, I serve in that capacity when I'm on a search committee. Haven't yet been asked to serve in that capacity when I wasn't expected to be on the search committee yet, but it's something I've offered in the past as well. You're very welcome. All right, so I do want to also talk about interviews. And I mentioned before, the being careful that we're paying attention to what is said and not how it's said. There are often issues with what we call language bias. So someone has a strong accent, someone doesn't speak in proper English. I still make mistakes myself, it happens. And a lot of times we get caught up on that and we don't listen to what's being said. So the rule of thumb is, did you understand what they said? Did they answer your question? And did their answer actually make sense for the question? And if yes, then you move on. You don't worry about how they said it. You just move on with the process. But other things to think about when you're looking at interviews, because this is that second stage where you start having issues with potential bias, making sure you're asking all candidates the same set of questions and usually in the same order as best you can. Anyone who's ever done an interview knows that sometimes candidates will answer a question, even though it wasn't quite asked, because it's part of what their answer is. And that's perfectly fine. But you typically don't want to just bounce around and randomly ask different questions to candidates, because it's not a fair way to compare them across their different abilities and skills. You also want to use that rubric to score your responses right away. We encourage you to score your responses right away, because if you don't score them right away, let's say you have 4 candidates come in and you wait to score after you've had all 4 candidates, there's usually 2 things that happen. Either the most recent candidate you heard becomes your top candidate because you remember them more easily, or the one candidate who was first is the first one in your mind, and you compared everyone else to that candidate throughout the process, and that's what shows up in your scoring. But after you listen to each candidate and you score them right away, you usually eliminate some of that bias. Bias always creeps in a little bit, but it does help to eliminate some of that bias. Also avoid asking biased interview questions. And of course, keep in mind, some questions that are also biased questions are illegal to ask. You usually have a list of approved questions that you cannot ask, and you know better. But there is a way that people can develop questions that are biased. And what we mean by that is a question that was written specifically with a candidate in mind, someone that you knew would be able to answer that question. And that happens a lot where you have a star candidate and you're interested in hearing more about their understanding of a topic, and it may not necessarily work for all the other candidates. It becomes a biased question because it was written with one candidate in mind, and you want to be very careful about that as well. Making sure you're ensuring all your candidates have the same opportunities to interact with library employees, and that there is an equal access to library employees. So this means candidates from diverse backgrounds who may be interested in meeting employees with diverse backgrounds, but also candidates not from diverse backgrounds who are interested in meeting candidates with diverse backgrounds. Like, they want to know everyone they're working with, but also not springing people that weren't on the list as part of the interview on a candidate, especially a diverse candidate, just because they want to meet that candidate without actually having them meet all candidates as well. Strangely enough, that happens more than it should. And then also make sure you have an equal experience if you happen to have both internal and external candidates. This happens a lot, and people say it's not necessarily directly related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it is. Internal candidates often do not get the same experience as an external candidate when they interview, which means that it's not fair to compare their performance in their interview with someone who was external and had a completely different interview setup, interview structure. Looks like Retha was saying all our interview questions are sent to HR for review and approval. We do ask all the same questions. Fantastic, yes. And so if this is something that's built into your structure, it makes it so much easier because that's why HR is keeping an eye on things for you. You do still have to keep an ear out for the follow-up questions that do tend to happen that sometimes come from a response that someone has, but it's really nice if you do have someone who has already gone through, reviewed your questions and pretty much put that stamp of approval on them and say, yes, good to go forward. So nice to hear that, Retha. The other thing I like to talk about is how you combat discriminatory promotion practices. And this is not just academic libraries. This happens a lot in any situation where you're trying to move from sometimes library 1, librarian 2, sometimes you're trying to move from someone who's working library tech and up to a different position. You want to make sure that everyone has the same access to promotion information and that it is a standardized process. So if there's a way to move from librarian 1 to librarian 2, that is documented, it aligns with your institution, and everyone has the same access to that information. Also, everyone should be hearing the same message from others about the standards and those expectations. So one person who asked a question about this should not hear that they have to do X, Y, and Z. And then another person who asked a question should not hear they have to do A, B, and C, right? They should be hearing the same message. This also includes equal access to mentorship and support. So if someone is receiving multiple avenues of mentorship and support and someone else is receiving none, that's not a fair promotional process, right? That means that someone is more likely to be promoted or moved up because they're receiving all this support, while others are not receiving as much or any support as well. You also want to make sure that when you're looking at promotion eligibility, it's based on the evidence you have and not on feelings or preferences or whether or not someone is liked. This happens entirely too much where there's someone's like, well, we just don't like this person, so we're not going to help promote them. That's not how promotion works. If this person is doing their job, they've hit the promotion standards, they should be elevated and move forward as well. And if possible, external reviewers are really important for this process, no matter what level you're in, because sometimes you do need that external voice to come in and look at what's being presented for promotion and say yes or no, like, yes, this aligns with the information you've shared with me, or it doesn't align with the information that's shared with me. This helps if you do have issues with the previous bullet point, where there's a lot of people who are based on how they feel about a person and not their actual performance in their job. The other thing we talk about when we're talking about cultural incapacity is the occurrence of microaggressions. And most of us have probably now heard what a microaggression is. I do like to still include this because I think we still struggle with this in our organizations, and we still struggle with this in general in the world, in my opinion. So microaggressions are those subtle slights, those insults, those indignities or denigrating messages that are usually directed at someone from a diverse background, someone who's different in some way. Now, Sue, who started this research years ago, defines this in 3 different ways. You have the micro assaults, which are those deliberate acts of harm. And so those are the things where people purposely say things to be hurtful, and they mean them to be hurtful, and they know they're hurtful. You have the micro insults, which are usually the spoken and sometimes unspoken insults. And traditionally what we think of when we think about microaggressions, where someone has said something that they think is not a big deal, but it comes across as being very negative for the person that they're talking about. And then you have the micro invalidations, which is the overlooking of feelings or experiences, typically voiced as, oh, they didn't mean it that way, or why do you always make things about race or about LGBTQ status or things like that, because you're invalidating the feelings that the person has and saying that, you know, it wasn't really a big deal. Now, a lot of research has actually been done about microaggressions, and we talk about them here because this is how we manifest the idea of devaluing someone or reduced expectations for some groups. They show up as microaggressions. And so racial microaggressions specifically are those brief everyday exchanges that send those denigrating messages to people of color because they belong to a racial minority group. They do specifically have racial microaggressions labeled because they happen because of someone's race or their minority group. Now, a lobby did research in libraries about this, academic libraries specifically, trying to figure out whether or not that people of color were reporting more experiences of either experiencing microaggressions or observing microaggressions in the workplace. And specifically did actually find that minority respondents were more likely to report both experiencing and observing, and that white respondents were likely to indicate not experiencing or observing microaggressions in the workplace, even though they were clearly happening. Now, Aurora Ramirez et al. Actually also did research and remind us that in our libraries, microaggressions also come from our patrons. And this is something we have to be aware of as well, because it does impact the workplace overall. And so you have things like assuming a younger librarian is, not actually a librarian, just a student, and also assuming that a librarian of color couldn't possibly be a librarian and asking to speak to the real librarian. And so those are typical microaggressions that happen from patrons towards librarians. Individually, this is not a big deal, but the reminder we have here is that as they happen, they have a negative cumulative effect on those who are experiencing them. What do these actually look like? A lot of these research is a really good place to look at for this. So in terms of experience of racial microaggressions, and I'm not going to read this whole chart, I know there's a lot here, but things like I was ignored at work because of my race, or a colleague told me that all people in my racial group are all the same, or a colleague treated me differently than a white colleague. So these were experiences of racial microaggressions in the workplace and how people reported in terms of whether or not they had experienced that. In terms of observations, it was things like a colleague was unfriendly or unwelcoming toward another librarian because of his or her race, or a colleague told another librarian that he or she was articulate after having assumed he or she would not be. That one happens quite a bit to a lot of people who come from different backgrounds. It's really important that we think about not only the experience of these microaggressions, but also if we're able to identify when they're happening to someone else, because that ability to observe it's happening indicates whether or not you might be able to do something to help support or do something about it as well. And so now we take a quick stop. I want to breathe for a moment. I think Devin's going to pop in here and help us with the quick poll, because I really want to see which of these you can actually say yes to. So here we go. So which of the following can you say yes to? So basically you can click the button if it's yes. I have experienced a microaggression directed at me in the workplace. I have observed a microaggression directed at someone else in the workplace, or I have committed a microaggression against someone in the workplace. And I'm going to respond as well. I think that's allowed for me to do. And we'll give it just a moment here to allow everyone to have a chance to send some responses in. And Devin, hopefully you can see numbers so you'll know if we're getting pretty close to ability to take a look at our results. Oh, here we go. And so we have 76%, I have experienced a microaggression directed at me at work, 82% I've observed a microaggression directed at someone else, and 47% I've committed a microaggression against someone in the workplace. And I think that it's one of those things where we're still seeing, as we're seeing here, 76%, 82% microaggressions are still happening in the workplace. But the ability to acknowledge that you have microaggressed someone is actually really important towards moving towards cultural competence, because you have to recognize that that is happening to be able to stop it from happening. And I'm one of the ones who actually clicked that. Have I microaggressed someone in the workplace? Not intentionally, but I did it. And I had to work to actually make sure that I apologize for one and improve my own behavior, because it does happen, even if you don't intend for it to happen. All right, thank you all for indulging me. I know these are quick polls. We're gonna go ahead and keep moving forward though. Now, I did want to share this, and I'm not saying that this is how you should respond to microaggressions, and I have a link to this in my resources so you'll be able to look at this. But it was interesting that the Granger College of Engineering put forth what they suggested you should do to respond to microaggressions. And they included everything from restating or paraphrasing, or asking the person to restate or paraphrase, just to make sure you were clear about what they actually meant when they said, pretending to not understand. I don't understand what you mean by that. What do you mean by that person is so much more articulate? Or what do you mean I'm so much more articulate? Using humor, which doesn't always work, but also the final one was reminding them of rules and policies. And what they're trying to say here is that typically a microaggression is an attack on a person in the workplace, a verbal attack on a person in the workplace, which should go against the rules or policies of most organizations, but usually isn't written down as a specific rule. But the idea that there are different ways that you can consider how to do that, how to respond to microaggressions, either directed at you or directed at someone else, is really important so that you don't feel like there's nothing that you can actually do. But we also have Aurora and Ramirez who specifically tell us that maybe we should also practice calling in rather than calling out. And what they're talking about here is specifically making sure that we don't just do the call out, like, I can't believe you said that, putting someone on the spot, trying to make them feel bad about what they said, and rather you invite them for a conversation about how it made you feel, what it meant in terms of what they actually said, and really having more about a conversation to move forward versus trying to shame someone, right, into improving their behavior. So I just want to put that out there as an option for those who are interested in thinking about how to respond in terms of the microaggressions that typically happen in the workplace as well. All right, so moving on, I know we spent a lot of time on the incapacity because, as I mentioned, there was more things to deal with there. If you're dealing with cultural blindness, once again, idea of treating everyone the same. This means we typically encourage assimilation. We ignore cultural strengths that we happen to have in our organizations. We blame our users for their circumstances. We don't value cultural competence training. We tend to have a very non-diverse workforce, and there's usually no structural or resource support for cultural competence. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to share an example that does come up a lot. And it's the idea, especially in academic libraries, that we spend a lot of time trying to assimilate our international students. And I think this happens for immigrants and communities as well. So this idea that the library is there to help them to assimilate into our culture instead of working to help them to continue being part of their own cultures or learning more about their culture. And so we have to acknowledge that it's often a struggle to adjust, whether you're coming to a campus or coming to a new community, and that you may be dealing with people who actually don't even understand that the purpose of the library here may be different than where they came from, that their experience with librarians may be different, that there may be some language issues, even though that's not always the case, and that for academic librarians especially, plagiarism can often be an issue as well. We have to remind ourselves that we can actually support them rather than trying to change them in this process. And so for those specifically working with international students, and again, I think this actually crosses over into other areas as well, creating an outreach plan for anyone from a different community is a great way to work against this idea of assimilation, recognizing also that international doesn't always mean ESL. So automatically saying we're going to create ESL classes doesn't necessarily help those who actually already speak English as well. Collaborating with partners who already work with international students or international populations, focusing on communication in terms of communicating with them where they're at versus where you're at, and then making sure you conduct user studies to actually see what their barriers and needs are and not make assumptions about what those barriers and needs actually are. I again say that I know this is listed as international students, but this is populations, right? People who come from different areas. All of these things definitely apply. Now, if we're talking about cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, once again, we're getting to a higher level here. So you start seeing things like valuing high quality services, a commitment to human and civil rights, hiring practices that actually support diverse workforces because we learn from what was happening in cultural incapacity, our ability to conduct our assessments, our ability to work to improve our service delivery. We may still see some token representation going on. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And there still may not be a clear plan for achieving cultural competence, but we're improving, right? We're doing much better. I do like to focus on assessment briefly because it's a reminder to make sure we're moving beyond counting people when we talk about diversifying our populations. Some counting is always necessary in libraries and it can be useful, but it tells a very limited story about the experiences of those who are using your resources or coming into your libraries or working with you in the library. So you need both quantitative and qualitative data. So this is just my reminder to everyone to conduct focus groups, have interviews, have conversations, and use that as well with making sure you understand what the numbers do look like. You also should always have an EDI plan. So this is just an equity diversity data plan. It's a plan that helps you collect some data and make sure you're collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, and then create action plans. If you're interested in actually understanding and making change in your organization, you need an action plan that's directly related to making those changes, especially when they are concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you have not done so yet, complete an organizational climate assessment, because this is going to help you first identify the dominant culture in your organization, and we all have one. You also want to make sure you identify the specific organizational issues that may impact specific employees who are working there. And then also it's going to help you better understand what's happening to those who are marginalized or historically excluded within your organization. Without that climate assessment, you may have a sense, it may be anecdotal, but you may not have a full understanding. And without that full understanding, you usually can't address the barriers and the issues that are there. For those of you who are working in specific departments, make sure you are reviewing your work, that you're actually looking at the EDI practices that you are currently have or that could fit. Maybe you haven't thought about it yet, but it's really important that you spend some time thinking about the EDI practices of your specific department, not just the library as a whole. And then if you have some already in place, start thinking about whether or not they're working really well. And then if you have some barriers to doing this work, start thinking about what those barriers are. Because if you have barriers to doing EDI work, it's really easy not to do the work, right? It's like, it's a roadblock. We don't have time for that. We've got work to do. But you need to identify the barriers so that you can actually move past them, move over them, knock them down, whichever one happens first. So I do want you to take just a moment to reflect on this, something to think about. We're not going to do a poll or anything for this one, but I want you to think on what barriers to integrating EDI do you feel you currently face in your work? And this is just something to kind of get you thinking through this process and thinking about what it might look like specifically for you in your organization. Now, the final reminder here is that we do want to avoid tokenism and racial capitalism in particular. And we mentioned that even at this stage, these things continue happening. A reminder that tokenism is the practice of doing something, usually hiring someone who belongs to a minority or a marginalized group, only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that you're actually being treated fairly in the organization, right? So it's this idea that we check the box. So we're not doing anything bad. Now, racial capitalism is the process of actually deriving some type of social or economic value from the racial identity of another person. And this does happen in workplaces as well. How do you avoid this? 4 suggestions. First of all, do not create false imagery of what your workplace looks like in terms of diversity. This means not using stock images of people from diverse cultural backgrounds, especially visible diverse backgrounds, as a way to sort of showcase either the people working in your library or in many cases, sometimes even our patrons, right? Those coming into libraries. You do want to work towards creating a workplace that truly reflects EDI. So reflect who does work there and reflect what people do know as well. Do the work towards diversifying all your staffing levels through fair and equitable hiring practices. So don't pretend that you have them. You make sure you do that work. And also try to create an organization that supports retention, because that's how you actually have people in your organization who are diverse and maintain them as well. Juan wants to know, could you please give an example of racial capitalism? Absolutely. And actually, this almost happened recently. I actually saw this on Twitter myself. But let's say that you advertise an event that's happening for your organization that people have to sign up for and attend, especially if they have to pay money to attend that event. And you use the image of someone who it would be a big draw for your organization, who happens to be a person of color who's talked about the topic that you're talking about. And that using that image encourages people to actually sign up for your event and attend your event and pay money to attend your event, only to find out that person has no connection to your event at all, was not involved in the planning, but you use their image as a way to do that. That actually recently happened. Smaller versions of this are organizations that continue to use the images or pictures of employees who are visibly diverse, who were employed there at some point, but are no longer employed there. And what they're using them for is a way to help maybe recruit other people or to show that they're being diverse. And even though that's not an economic gain, it can be a social gain, right? A way to in some ways, trick someone into thinking that you're a diverse organization, that you want to work there. That is a form of racial capitalism at its best, and happens a lot. Happened to me for quite a few years at a couple organizations who continue to post my picture as if I still work there. And that made some people look at the organization in a different way, like, oh, Kawanna works there. Okay, it can't be such a bad place, right? Hopefully that answers your question. Now, cultural competence, this is at the higher level, remember, so we are now exemplifying what this looks like through demonstration of acceptance and respect of cultural differences. So we're looking at our mission statements, our policies, our practices, because we've integrated cultural competence into those areas. We include our community in all aspects of our core functions. We implement policies to develop a culturally competent workforce. We support cultural competence, and we have reciprocal community engagement. And typically that means that we are working with our community and they're working with us, and we're giving back to them as they are giving to us in the process. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I do want to talk about the importance of integrating EDI into our statements, our policies and processes. Review all your public statements, every public statement you made, your policies, both internal and external, and also your processes for EDI. You want to make sure you're being careful not to overly broadly use the term diversity or diverse within messages to kind of signify what you're doing, when diversity can mean so many different things. You want a separate EDI statement in addition to integrating EDI into these different areas as well. Make sure you're setting some EDI goals and objectives, part of your strategic planning process as a separate process, and then having an EDI action plan, a way to talk about how you're going to fully engage in these processes. All in one, yes, I'm glad that worked. Your image was used in the brochure too. Yep, happens very frequently, often without our knowledge. Because we're photogenic, right? We let people take pictures of us all the time. A lot of people are very interested in how to conduct an EDI policy review. You'd be happy to know I'm actually working on an article about this because I've gone through this briefly. But you go through this process of making sure you're reviewing and updating all your internal and external policies on a rotating schedule continuously, specifically looking for EDI elements or issues that may be found in those policies. And so I usually say it's asking the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how, right? So who is the policy written for? Is anyone not covered? Is anyone left out? Is there a reason they're left out of the policy? Who wrote the policy? Who was included in the policy writing? All the way down to where does it live? Can you even find the policy? Why was it even created in the first place? Do you even still need the policy? A lot of times this is directed at policies related to homelessness, bags, odors, things like that. We have a lot of policies in libraries that are definitely written for a very specific group, though we couch them as a library-wide policy. And you just want to be careful that you don't have policies that are written in a way that are meant to be biased, that are meant to keep certain people from utilizing your resources or being in those spaces as well. And yes, I know I need to acknowledge there are safety issues, of course, with a lot of things we do in libraries. I'm not saying we should not be safe or have safety policies. I'm just saying we need to be careful that we haven't written a policy specifically for a group, but couched it as being applied to everyone when it's not actually applied to everyone. Now, the reminder about community and participatory engagement just means that we are doing our assessment, our outreach, and our planning and our evaluation with our communities in mind and actually talking to our communities, especially if you work in a very diverse community. So you want to introduce their voices and their experiences to the work you're actually doing because you're recognizing that they have knowledge and thoughts that are actually important as well and should influence the services and the processes and the programs that you offer. This process tends to be more inclusive naturally because you're talking to those who are hopefully using your resources. It's very collaborative in nature and in many cases seen as being democratic and transformative, which means you're helping to transform that community in a positive way. Now, finally, cultural proficiency. I mentioned this idea of holding culture in a high esteem and guiding the foundation of our work. This is where you start adding back to the cultural competence knowledge base. You start giving back to that process. You're employing experts in cultural competence who are coming to work in your organization. You're mentoring others along the continuum. You're helping them see that maybe they're at a lower level on that continuum and they want to be higher on that continuum. You're advocating for the underserved and you're partnering with others as well. So this whole process, this is what we're trying to get to when we get to the end and get to the cultural proficiency stage. Now, a lot of people build on top of this and start saying we need to move from cultural competence to cultural humility. And I like to introduce the term for those who may not have heard it. It tends to come, this case specifically from the medical field. And they were talking about physician-patient dynamics, but I think we can argue that we can substitute librarian-patron, librarian-user dynamics as well. But this idea of cultural humility is that you're making this lifelong commitment to being self-evaluative, to being self-reflective, and to critiquing yourself through this process, but that you're working to actually redress some of those power imbalances that exist. In this case, the power imbalance between physician-patient, but for us, between librarians and users, or sometimes between, if you're working academic librarians and staff and students and administration as well. And that you're developing something that's mutually beneficial, non-paternalistic, and it's a partnership with your communities on behalf of those who are actually part of those populations. Visually, this is usually a little bit easier to see. And this comes from Project Ready, which is actually over at UNC. If you haven't seen this, this is actually a free module you can run through if you're interested in learning more about cultural competence, specifically in libraries and cultural humility. But to get to the cultural humility stage, you have to build cultural competence first. That's why I always start with that conversation, because it's really important that you have that strong base of the self-reflection and the understanding of cultures, of yourself as well, before you start thinking about how can I now use this information to push back against the system? How do I start holding the system accountable, right, for the way that it is structured as well? How do I start dismantling it, right? That's the big dream. How do we break it down as well? So I do another check-in, poll time. I want to know where you think you are on that cultural competence continuum, right? And in terms of, are you gaining cultural knowledge? Are you developing cultural self-awareness? Are you understanding and redressing power imbalances? Are you holding systems accountable? You'll probably notice that this kind of moved it directly into the culture of humility realm, but where are you kind of at in this process? All right, so we're understanding and redressing power imbalances, 46%, 43% developing cultural self-awareness, and 11% gaining cultural knowledge. So we're on the list. And Leah, yeah, could have checked a few of those, right? You would check the higher one, right? So I think we're all going to say, yes, we're holding, we're not quite holding systems accountable. Even I feel like I'm not quite there yet, that I'm trying, but I feel like I'm still at the understanding and redressing power imbalances, right? I'm getting there. And I'm hoping to start moving towards holding systems accountable, starting with my own organization, starting with the program at ECU as well. All right, so probably the more important part of this conversation, and we're gonna not worry about the other continuum thing here, what can you do as an individual, right, to work towards being culturally competent, to work towards creating these organizations? Well, of course, training. You're coming to a session now. Continuous training is going to be really important. Anything that is of interest related to bias or being reflective or privilege, things like that, will probably be something that would help you through this process. Self-education is really important, not relying on other people to give you things to read, looking it up yourself, but doing that self-reflection. So if you're already someone who journals or goes through diaries, continue doing that work, right? Continue doing that type of journaling. Also, a lot of people self-reflect through poetry or self-reflect through art. Continue doing that as well. Make sure you are critically self-evaluating your work as well. So not just you as a person, but the work you do in the library. And are you actually holding yourself accountable for your own actions, for what you can actually do to work with the users, with your colleagues? Try to be a mentor, find a mentor, collaborate with others, partner with others. You don't have to do this alone. This is something we can definitely do together. But also make sure you're being very vocal and being very persistent in this process. You have to speak up, you have to keep at it. I mentioned you can backslide on the continuum. Don't let that get to you. You can always come back forward. You can always keep moving towards that cultural proficiency. Now, in terms of what organizations can do and leaders can do, this can be really important and something that if you don't even feel you're a leader yet, you may become one, or something you want to take back to your organization. Organizations and leaders need to be open to change, and you definitely need to challenge the status quo, right? So this is how we've always done it, needs to go away. That's just because we always did it that way. That needs to be burned down. We can't do that anymore. Make sure you're being transparent as a leader and also within your organization, especially with your employees. And you want to build towards inclusive decision-making. So the voices of those who work with you, not necessarily for you, with you, should be included when you're making decisions that impact everyone. That you support efforts in both words and actions, especially for those who are trying to engage in this work, that you're actually saying, yes, I support this work, and this is how I'm going to help you be successful in doing that work. And definitely focus on accountability. So hold people accountable for their actions, especially their bad actions in the organization, especially when they're directed at someone because of racial differences or cultural differences. Hold everyone accountable for EDI work. Everyone should actually be doing EDI work. It's not just the few who decide to select it. We all need to be engaged and involved in this work as well. And then also apply forward-looking accountability. And what we're doing there is focusing not on blaming people, but on recognizing that mistakes have been made and that harm has been caused, right? That someone has been hurt by this process. We want to move forward, though. We want to find a way to identify a lesson, like what can we learn from this, and how can we make sure that we change our system so that it doesn't happen again? Create what they call safe habits within the organization, and then try to make sure that we don't have recurrence of what's going on, and that we're not just punishing someone, because punishment doesn't usually teach people anything. They're not going to learn from it. It often breeds anger, as a matter of fact. So typically, you don't want to necessarily just punish. You want to make sure that you are teaching a lesson to everyone who was involved in the situation, and that we learn from what's happening in our organizations. All right, so that was way too much information. I know, I apologize. I think we only have like, oh goodness, 7 minutes for questions here. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and I have all those references and resources. I'm gonna make sure that I've sent those to Devin for anyone interested in doing a little bit of self-education and reading further on some of those things. But in these few minutes, I hope that you will bounce off, and actually it's 3 minutes, oh goodness. Tell me if you have questions. What are some of your thoughts? Let's talk a little bit if we can. Yes, so yeah, either in chat or you can unmute yourselves as well. I also encourage you, I know, like I said, it's a lot of information. I do this to my students as well. I don't expect them to have questions right away. Please know you can follow up with me. You can email me directly at ECU. My email address should be posted very broadly. If you happen to find me on my personal website, you can email me directly there as well. You can find me on Twitter. If you want to engage in conversation on Twitter as well, please look me up. I'm always more than happy to engage in conversation. We definitely have time for questions. Hannah, I think I see. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Bright. Thank you so much for this webinar. I've been waiting for it for a couple of weeks now. I've really I started a new library 7 months ago.
Oh, okay.
I'm here at the University of New Orleans, and there hasn't been a lot going on in this library as far as kind of DEI initiatives. Mm-hmm. I see the beginnings of a few things here, maybe in collections or maybe over here, and I work in services. Yeah. So I have the wacky idea that I'm going to start a committee, and it's going to be, it has an outward focus to try to maybe sponsor an event, you know, once a semester. And then the rest of it is really internal work, like the policy review. That's already on my list of things to do. So being in services, I want to review our policies and make sure that there are probably some low-hanging fruit, you know, there that we can do, for example, for students who are differently abled or have physical disabilities, for example, right? Yes. Low vision or mobility things. Like, I want that on the website. I want all of my staff members to be aware of it and be able to do it and perform it should, you know, that student appear. There are lots of other things. I'm very interested in the idea of your EDI reviewer for hiring, because hiring is one of those things that the library has to collaborate, you know, often with an HR unit. And depending on how awesome or not awesome your HR unit is.
Not awesome. Yep. Yeah,
not awesome. That's a technical term. They may not have a lot of expertise, or they may not have the awareness of this as a crucial issue. So I'm just thinking about, you know, who else can I ask in terms of, you know, resources, guidance, advice, consultations, to start bringing some of this stuff up to par. Yeah. You know, never mind being a high achiever, up to par.
Right, at least up to par. Yeah, and I think it's good that we emphasize that your HR department is there to protect the library, protect the university, or protect the organization. Let's just be honest about that. They have a job to do, which means they don't necessarily always have things in place to help you with some of these barriers you're facing. They're just worried. They don't want you to mess up. They don't want to be sued. So definitely having someone who has that expertise, has that interest, and is willing to serve in that capacity, and probably isn't necessarily going to be someone from HR, right? They're not necessarily going to have the time or capacity to do that. There have been organizations, though, that have put that in place. And I used to have a list. I need to find that list of institutions that actually had external reviewers from HR that were assigned to search committees, including in the library, for this particular purpose. And so I'm gonna make a note to myself to find that list so that I can share it. So if you'd be interested in that, Hannah, maybe follow up with me.
I would. Yeah. If I can have one follow-up question, and I'll turn it over to other people who have burning questions. It makes me wonder, in the HR world, is there maybe some kind of, I don't know, program, certificate, initials after your name, kind of a deal that HR professionals get, so that we could turn around and do train the trainer on campus?
Well, there are credentials that some HR professionals have that are specifically related to EEI, but not necessarily related to EDI hiring and like search
Yeah.
committees. But it doesn't
Okay.
mean they wouldn't be able to directly use that skill set to train someone for that information. But that's actually, see, this, I'm a researcher at heart, so I'm like, I want to find out for sure if anyone's moved in that direction yet, because I do know there are certificates out there specifically for HR for EDI, right? It's part of it. But how much of that covers search committees, the hiring process,
And hiring.
those particular things? So I'm going to add those to my list. I want you to follow up with me because that'll also keep me accountable to make sure I get you some information on that.
Okay, thank you so very much. And thank you for this webinar. Really interesting and good content. Appreciate you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And I think we're over time, but I know we're going into the small groups, right, Devin?
Yes. Yes.
So maybe it would be possible for those who had a question for me to join a small group with me, because I can stick around.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that we have at least 3 different follow-up questions. One's kind of a similar one. But folks, if it's possible for you to stick around for just, you know, even if it's just for a couple of minutes,
I can start barreling
that
through
would be
those.
great. Kawanna, is it okay if I include your email address in the follow-up email so that folks can reach out to you?
Please do.
Hannah will later. Okay,
Yes,
awesome.
absolutely.
Great. Well, folks, if you're available, please stick around. If not, then have a good rest of your Wednesday.